our training today on preventing and responding to domestic violence in the workplace. Next slide, please. I think we covered this, but just FYI, I'm Nina. I'm the program director at Futures, and I'm going to be co-facilitating with Jordyn. Next slide. So just to give you all some background on who we are, our initiative Workplaces Respond is a national resource center, and we work in partnership with advocates and employers of all kinds to prevent and respond to the impacts of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and sexual harassment in the world of work. And as part of that mission, we provide free consultation, resources on a lot of different topics that you can find at our resource library. And we also offer trainings like this one to support employers and employees in making their workplaces safer. Next slide. So this is a quick overview of what we're hoping to cover with you all in our time today. We're going to start with defining some key terms. We'll talk about the prevalence and impacts of domestic violence and how employers can respond to these impacts. We'll also give a high-level overview of some of the employment protections that are available to survivors of domestic violence, and also some considerations for how all of you in your respective roles can create and advocate for an effective policy and program to prevent and respond to domestic violence in your own workplace. And then we'll close with some resources and a brief evaluation. Next slide. So hopefully these objectives align with that agenda. We can go to the next slide. So we're going to start with some definitions, and I know many of you may be familiar with some of this information already, but I want to make sure that we all have the same understanding of these concepts. Next slide. So when we talk about workplace violence, at Futures, we like to use the term world of work as a way to describe all of the different places and settings that violence can occur, right? So the world of work can refer to any location where a worker is performing their job duties, and that can include a physical workplace or a fully remote workplace. It can include areas where workers might be taking their rest or meal breaks, commuting. It can be violence mediated through work-related communication, right? And we use this more expansive term to underscore the fact that violence and the impacts of violence includes public and private spaces and digital spaces. And under this framing, we're also highlighting the fact that all of these different forms of violence that you see on the screen, domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, stalking, and sexual harassment, happen within the world of work, but they can also happen away from work. And regardless of where that violence occurs, it's going to have an impact on the safety and well-being of workers, employers, and the workplace as a whole. Now we're going to get into how those impacts can intersect with the workplace, specifically for domestic violence, a little later on. But I want to highlight that all of these different forms of violence, sexual assault, stalking, can all occur within the context of an intimate relationship. So there's a lot of overlap in these behaviors. And another thing to note, kind of especially as we go into the legislative pieces of this presentation, is that sexual harassment is explicitly described as a form of sex-based employment discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. But other forms of sexual violence, such as sexual assault, domestic violence, and stalking, can also be considered forms of sexual harassment when they occur in the workplace, involve workplace associates, or occur in the course of a worker doing their job. And this creates a liability for employers under Title VII and under state anti-discrimination laws in a variety of situations, which is often why you'll find that many employers will have a standalone policy that just addresses sexual harassment, even if it doesn't explicitly address any of these other forms of violence. Oftentimes, this is because they don't recognize that these forms of violence do overlap, could be considered sexual harassment, and they're all impacting the workplace. Next slide. So domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior that is used by one partner to gain or maintain control and power over an intimate partner or a family member. And it can include a range of tactics: physical, emotional, sexual, economic, psychological threats or actions, or other patterns of coercive behavior to influence another person within the relationship. And this graphic on the slide might be familiar to many of you. It is the power and control wheel, and it's a tool that's used to display the range of tactics that someone might use to exhibit power and control over another person in their relationship. And that dynamic can translate to the world of work and beyond. And there are a lot of different variations of this power and control wheel, some that use different terminology. But for this version, and I apologize that the text is so small, but the inside of the wheel shows some of the continuing behaviors and actions someone might use to exert power and control. So coercion, threats, intimidation, using someone's children against them, isolating a survivor. And then you have actions like those depicted on the outer ring that are physical or sexual violence that could be used to reinforce the use of these more subtle and repetitive tactics that you see in the inner ring. And under some state laws, domestic violence can include abuse in familial relationships, such as between siblings or between a parent and child. That's also called family violence. And then domestic violence can also occur within a dating relationship. And when it occurs in that relationship, it's called dating violence. So a lot of different terms that could be used to describe domestic violence. Next slide. And I think you have to click in. There we go. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go back. Perfect. So I want to zoom in on one of the coercive tactics in the power and control wheel that has really clear implications for a survivor's economic well-being, and that's economic abuse, which encompasses behaviors to control someone's access to money and financial resources. And this can look like withholding or limiting access to banking or financial information, not allowing a survivor to access shared income or accounts, or taking their paycheck and just giving them a restricted allowance, so exerting control over a survivor's own income. Next slide. And another form of economic abuse is called employment sabotage. That encompasses behaviors that are intended to prevent someone experiencing domestic violence or other forms of violence from obtaining or maintaining their employment. And the goal really is to deprive someone of the financial resources and opportunities that they need to leave an abusive relationship. And some of the tactics that a perpetrator might use to sabotage someone's employment is maybe causing a survivor to miss work or harassing them while they're at work, so they're distracted and it impairs their job performance. It might cause them to eventually get fired if they miss too much work or not able to do their job. And one of the nefarious kind of impacts of employment sabotage is not only that the survivor loses access to that important income and financial security, which is a means to leave the relationship, but it also isolates that person from who's experiencing domestic violence from others in the workplace who might be able to provide resources or support. And so now I'm going to pass it to my colleague Jordyn to talk about some of the other impacts of domestic violence as it intersects with the workplace.
Thanks, Nina, and great to be here with you all today. We can go over to the next slide, and then we can go over to the next slide after that. So let's take a look at some grounding data that shows the scope and urgency of domestic violence as not only a deeply personal experience for survivors, but as a broader issue with significant implications for safety, public health, and the justice system response. So between 2009 and 2012, domestic violence made up 21% of all violent victimization in the United States. And in other words, more than 1 in 5 violent incidents during that period involved an intimate partner. We also know that nearly 1 in 4 women in the United States report experiencing violence from a current or former spouse or partner at some point in their lives. And this number only represents those who felt safe enough to disclose their experiences, but many survivors may not report their abuse to law enforcement or seek help through formal channels. Additionally, the impact of domestic violence is not limited to private settings. As Nina shared earlier, it shows up in the workplace. An estimated 27% of violent events in the workplace are directly related to domestic violence. Perpetrators may use the workplace to threaten or harm a victim, knowing that it is one of the few predictable places that they can be found. And perhaps most alarmingly is the link between domestic violence and mass shootings. Studies show that about 59% of mass shootings in the United States are connected to domestic violence, either as a motive or part of the perpetrator's history. And this highlights that domestic violence has serious implications for broader public safety beyond individual relationships. Let's go to the next slide. And so how does domestic violence impact the workplace as a whole and other coworkers in the working environment? Research shows that between 30 and 53% of employee survivors lose their jobs as a result of domestic violence. So this is that employment sabotage piece that Nina was talking about. So whether that be due to factors connected to the abuse itself, it could be the survivor may miss work because of injuries, court appointments, mental health struggles. They also may face harassment or stalking in the workplace that interferes with their ability to safely maintain their employment. And the economic consequences of losing a job further deepens survivors' vulnerability and making it harder for them to be able to leave that relationship. Nearly half, about 47% of employed survivors report being assaulted by their abuser before going to work. This subjects survivors to immediate physical danger and can cause significant emotional and physical trauma, making it difficult for them to be able to concentrate or carry out their job responsibilities throughout the workday. And perhaps most concerning for workplace safety, 67% of survivors report that the perpetrator came to their place of employment. The workplace can become a site of ongoing intimidation, stalking, or physical violence, and this behavior threatens the safety of not only the survivor, but also coworkers, supervisors, and customers who may witness that violence. So we can go to the next slide. And so now we'll go over a few additional impacts of survivors who are experiencing violence and how that may be showing up in the workplace. Survivors may show visible physical injuries, bruises, cuts, or fractures, but they may also experience chronic health conditions resulting from long-term prolonged abuse. Domestic violence may disrupt survivors' ability to maintain consistent attendance and their schedules. They may frequently have to miss work or arrive late due to injuries, court dates, or medical appointments as a result of experiencing that abuse. Specifically, survivors of stalking lose an average of 10 days of paid work per year. Survivors of rape lose about 8 days, and those experiencing physical violence lose around 7 days. The mental and emotional toll of abuse, including trauma, anxiety, and fear, may make it difficult for survivors to perform their job duties throughout the workday. This can lead to mistakes or reduced productivity, and that can sometimes be misunderstood by supervisors as a lack of motivation, but in reality, they're going through experiencing violence. Additionally, another sign often observed in the workplace is an increase in personal calls or unexpected visits from their abusive partner. We can go to the next slide. Survivors may also appear agitated, withdrawn, bored, angry, sad, or hypervigilant. These are all common responses to someone experiencing violence. And then also nearly 9 out of 10 survivors report experiencing employment sabotage. And as a result, up to 60% of survivors experience job loss connected to domestic violence. And then tragically, domestic violence can escalate to its most severe consequence, homicide. Domestic violence incidents linked to the workplace can sometimes lead to fatal outcomes. So we can go to the next slide. So we'll talk through a little bit about how those
the people who are causing harm, how are they impacting the workplace, or how are they also being impacted by this violence? Perpetrators of domestic violence often experience disruptions in their own work attendance. Studies show that 42% of offenders are chronically late to work. This pattern of absenteeism and tardiness can reflect the stress, instability, and preoccupation related to their abusive behaviors. Almost half, 48% of perpetrators report difficulty concentrating while at work. This cognitive distraction can stem from their ongoing abusive behaviors, also if they're going through legal issues or other personal conflicts. And like survivors, this difficulty being able to concentrate at work can impact their job performance and productivity. A significant and concerning behavior is the misuse of employer resources by perpetrators in the workplace. Around 75% use workplace tools such as phones, laptops, and other equipment to control, monitor, or threaten their partners. This misuse not only compromises workplace safety, but it can also create liability and legal risk for the employers. And then lastly, nearly 20% of perpetrators of intimate partner violence reported causing or nearly causing serious accidents at work because they were distracted. And this highlights how abusive behaviors extend beyond personal relationships and can directly jeopardize safety in the workplace for the perpetrator, the survivor, coworkers, and the broader community. You can go to the next slide. So, data from a 2012 survey of men participating in batterer intervention programs found that 25% of respondents admitted to being late to work specifically because of their abusive behaviors. And this absenteeism reflects how their personal actions directly interfere with their professional responsibilities. You can go to the next slide. The same study also estimated that perpetrators' lateness and related work absences cost employers approximately 5.4 million in lost wages. Additionally, a striking 80% of perpetrators acknowledged that their own job performance suffered as a direct result of their abusive behavior. And also 19% of perpetrators reported causing or nearly causing an accident at work. You can go to the next slide. So when addressing domestic violence, it is important to place the person causing harm at the center of the impacts of their violence. While survivors and communities bear many consequences, the root cause lies in the choices and actions of the harm doer. Recognizing this helps to ensure accountability to remain where it belongs. Domestic violence is not just a private matter confined to one intimate relationship. The impacts ripple throughout the community ecosystem. Survivors face physical, emotional, and economic challenges. Family and friends often experience emotional distress and may struggle with how to provide support to their peers who are experiencing this violence. Coworkers and supervisors are affected too. They may witness changes in colleagues' behavior, face disruptions in workplace safety, or be drawn into conflicts into the workplace. And beyond the immediate circle, the community at large feels the weight of domestic violence through increased demands on social services, law enforcement, healthcare, and the judicial system. It's important to remember that domestic violence is a public health and safety concern that requires a coordinated community-wide response. You can go to the next slide. And just as a quick note, as we talk about survivors, it's important to recognize that abuse impacts survivors in very different ways. There's no single survivor experience. Every person's journey is unique, and how they are able to manage or cope with trauma as a result of experiencing that violence is highly context specific and individualized. Their behaviors, decisions, and coping strategies are shaped by their environment, resources, and support systems. And so it's important when engaging with survivors to prioritize empathy, patience, and approaching the conversation in a non-judgmental manner. Survivors are resilient individuals who are responsible, hardworking, and conscientious, just like everybody else in our communities and our workplaces. So we can go to the next slide. And so we've talked about the impacts of violence for those who are experiencing violence. Now we'll do a little bit more of a deeper dive into the ways that trauma and experiencing trauma can manifest in survivors' behaviors in the workplace. So these types of emotional trauma responses can include feeling numbness, apathy, or withdrawal as a way to cope with the stress that they're experiencing. Anxiety and fear may manifest as heightened worry or discomfort in certain situations, and many survivors may carry feelings of guilt or shame, anger, or irritability. And depression is common and can contribute to low motivation or energy. And in severe cases, survivors may experience suicidal thoughts or ideation as a result of experiencing trauma. Trauma can also manifest physically, so survivors may suffer from gastrointestinal issues like nausea or stomach pain, persistent headaches. Chronic pain can become a daily challenge. Some survivors may suffer with panic attacks or difficulty being able to focus. And then trauma also can show up impacting a survivor's cognitive processes. So survivors frequently report difficulty concentrating, making decisions, or processing information efficiently. Flashbacks or triggers or intense involuntary memories of the traumatic event can occur unexpectedly, and it can disrupt the task that they were trying to work on. Survivors may experience hypervigilance or being constantly on alert. They may drain their mental energy, and it may make it difficult for them to be able to relax. And all of these emotional, physical, and cognitive challenges often translate into observable workplace impacts and impacts on their performance in the workplace. So increased absenteeism may occur as survivors manage health and safety concerns. Missed deadlines or incomplete work can be a consequence of concentration difficulties. And overall, there may be a noticeable decline in job performance, which can further affect their confidence or stability in the workplace. And so, understanding these expressions of trauma helps survivors, supervisors, coworkers, and other members of your organization to be able to recognize when someone may be struggling and encourage trauma-informed responses to be able to support them. So with that, I will pass it back over to Nina, who will go over some effective programs that employers can implement to support survivors in their workplace.
Thanks so much, Jordyn. Next slide. So we're going to just start this section off with a brief poll. Hopefully, Sarah, you can pop that up in Zoom, asking you all if your employer has a policy to prevent and respond to domestic violence. And you can say yes, no, I don't know. You can also reply in the chat if you feel comfortable. Okay, I'm seeing yes, I don't know. Okay. I'm seeing a lot of yeses. Okay, that's great. Next slide, please. Okay, so why would we have a workplace policy on DV? One reason that we often start with the data on prevalence rates is to illustrate just how common it is for someone in any workplace to be a survivor of some form of violence and experience the impacts of that violence. And as we saw in the power and control wheel, all forms of violence, including domestic violence, are rooted in the power disparities and dynamics that exist in our society. And so they're going to show up in our workplaces. And so employers have a duty to maintain a safe and respectful workplace for all their workers, just as a baseline. And what a comprehensive policy can do is mitigate the preventable threats to the workplace, right? No policy is able to guarantee complete safety in every situation. But when an employer or workplace only reacts in the moment when a big crisis happens or there's a violent incident and they haven't taken any prevention measures or thought through what they're putting in their policy manual to address the impacts of violence, there are consequences for everyone, right? Thinking back to the graphic that Jordyn shared, consequences for survivors who feel unsafe, for their colleagues and supervisors who want to support them and may not know how, and also for the broader community. So domestic violence can be really destabilizing for everyone in the workplace. And so we want a policy where everyone in the workplace in their own specific role, whether they're a survivor, a coworker, a supervisor, HR rep, they all feel better prepared to know how to respond. Next slide. So clear definitions are an important element of an effective policy, right? Because they create a shared vocabulary for talking about all of these different forms of violence with employees. And there are several terms, many of which we already talked about in the first part of this session, that people don't necessarily encounter in their daily professional lives. A lot of you may, work in wraparound services or work directly with DV survivors and may be familiar with those terms, but we want to make sure that everyone has a shared vocabulary to talk about the different types of violence. And this is especially important when talking about domestic violence because many individuals may not recognize their experiences as violence or abuse. And so one of the things that we recommend is to help individuals better identify these different forms of violence is by supporting your definitions with specific examples. So workers can connect all of these terms back to specific behaviors. And your workplace may also want to define phrases that a worker who's experiencing domestic violence may hear from a victim service provider or advocate if they seek support. So phrases like protection order or a safety plan can support an employee in crisis who may not be familiar with these terms. And then different states and localities have different laws and protections in place for survivors. And there's also different guidelines and requirements on how these laws apply based on a number of different factors. Size of an organization, where an organization conducts its business. So we want to make sure that all the policies are adapted to the specific workplace and include all the applicable laws for all the employees. And many federal, state, and local laws define domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking for the purpose of protecting against employment discrimination or mandating the provision of paid time off from work for survivors, obtaining protective orders, and many other reasons. And so a little later, when we get into the overview on state level protections for survivors, we're going to talk about how those apply to workers experiencing these forms of violence. And employers can and should go well beyond these basic protections to ensure that their policy is accurately addressing the needs of their workers. So these laws that we're going to get into are just a starting place. Another important element is making sure that you're integrating your policies around domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and you'll see this acronym DVSAS, which we try not to use too many acronyms, but it's just that's what it stands for if you see it. Incorporating those policies into your pre-existing employee handbooks and manuals. So having a standalone policy that calls out or addresses domestic violence is not going to be super effective, right? If it's kept separate from the rest of your workplace policies. Many people, for a variety of reasons, may not identify as a survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault or stalking, and we want to make sure that they're still aware of their rights and their protections and how they can access support. So make sure that these policies are integrated into any handbooks or staff-facing HR sites. And that includes integrating your definition. So for example, any section that defines different types of leave might include a definition for safe leave or other types of legally protected leave for survivors. And then lastly, make review and education around this policy a standard part of employee onboarding, right? Very few people have their employee manual or policy handbook memorized. And when people are in crisis, they do not want to go on a scavenger hunt to find a specific section of a policy that they've never seen before, or where to go to find resources. So employers should really be integrating education on the workplace policy, on domestic violence and these other forms of violence as a standard part of employee orientation and onboarding. And this is a really simple way to ensure that this important information is covered. And by including in routine onboarding, it's also sending a message that the employer is taking these issues seriously and treating it like any other worker health and safety issue. Next slide. So an effective policy should ideally define roles and responsibilities for employers and workers, and policies should incorporate relevant protections for all employees within an organization, right? So you should audit your policy regularly to make sure it's up to date, but also that it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's meant to be a resource that informs employees that help is available and outlines steps, what steps need to be taken to access protections. And ideally, it should also anticipate the questions that workers who are experiencing these forms of violence might have and are afraid to ask. So if your employer or workplace has a policy in place, and it sounds like most of you do, make sure those policies are being reviewed regularly so you know where the gaps are, and think about how or if it's effectively addressing the needs of survivors in your workplace. And lastly, thinking about how your policy fits into your broader workplace efforts to prevent and address violence. So a policy is a really good foundation to build upon, but it's just one piece of what should be an overall prevention and response program. So there should be language in your policy to ensure that all employees have the same shared understanding and knowledge base around how different forms of violence can impact the workplace, right? Thinking about all of the different types of work environments, it's really important to reflect and identify safety threats and risk factors for violence that are specific to your workplace, and then tailor your policies and training and incident reporting mechanisms to reflect the realities of that particular environment. Next slide, please. So this image here is just one framework for thinking about how to tie a workplace policy into a broader set of efforts to address violence. So a key piece of prevention, as I may have mentioned, is really rooted in workplace culture, because the culture in a work environment can have a really profound impact on the risk of violence occurring or escalating. So you want to make sure that your workplace reflects your commitments as an employer and organization that is committed to supporting employees and maintaining a safe environment. And that workplace culture is really the anchor for everything else, right? Your policies, which is the language that you're putting in your employee handbooks or contracts, the practices, so how are those policies being implemented? And then the tailored supports, which are, how are those responses available to someone when the need arises? And this process, as you can see from the graphic, is not meant to be static, right? It's iterative. Workplace environments can change, the laws can change, and the protections available to survivors can change. So it's important to revisit these policies, make sure everyone understands what they mean and how they're being put into practice, and then develop an intentional process for how training, education, and other supports are being integrated to support these policies. And this should all be happening, hopefully, in tandem with cultural change. So we advocate for better policy and programs to address violence, but we also need to work towards shifting norms and creating a workplace culture where everybody feels safe and survivors are comfortable sharing their experiences and getting the support that they need. Next slide. So as a recap, this is no means an exhaustive list of best practices, but just some key takeaways as you're thinking through your own workplace prevention and response program. So one is employers can show that this is a priority issue for them by creating an advisory group that is tasked with moving this work forward, right? Leadership plays a really important role in creating buy-in to revise or create new policies and programs. But advisory groups should really have representation from workers at all levels of an organization, right? Not just management. And one of the reasons is because policies that are developed with staff input tend to be more effective. They're more likely to be used or complied with when there's that buy-in from having been part of the process from the start. But secondly, workplace violence impacts everybody, and so it needs to be framed as a shared responsibility. And we've already talked about the importance of definitions, but just want to highlight again that there is no one-size-fits-all policy for addressing the impacts of violence in a workplace. That's because some of the core elements that will inform a good policy, baseline definitions, reporting channels, the supports that might be available to workers, have to be contextualized to the workplace. Maybe you work in a health clinic or courtroom, maybe your workplace is remote. So it's really important to develop a shared set of definitions, and that can determine what needs to be incorporated into your policy. And then build out reporting processes that address the needs of survivors and respond to perpetrators. From the statistics that Jordyn shared, we know how common domestic violence is, and there might be both survivors and perpetrators of violence in your workplace. So you want to make sure that there are reporting procedures and policies that address survivors' needs and also hold perpetrators accountable. And then lastly, creating resources and policies that support survivors, right? This can look like making confidential trauma-informed counseling available to all employees and having local referral lists to support services and crisis hotlines ready to go. And then determine an educational process for policy implementation. Something we keep emphasizing, right? It's great to have a policy, but if you don't know where it lives or what it means, it's not going to be super useful. And lastly, education can include training, but we also encourage folks to look for more passive educational opportunities to reach staff, right? So maybe asking for a full day training is a tough sell, but you can still, put up posters and referral lists and safety cards. All of this can still support survivors and also do that deeper work of shifting work culture. Next slide. Okay, so now that we've talked through some of the considerations for building out a prevention and response program, I want to highlight some of the legal protections and supports that are available for survivors of domestic violence and also other forms of violence. And just a disclaimer at the start, I am not a lawyer, and this information is not legal advice. I'm going to provide a very general overview of some of the state level protections. And if you have questions about how these laws might apply to your specific case, please consult with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. We also have a separate project on our team that is dedicated entirely to the employment rights of survivors, and we'll put that information, we'll share that information at the end. So you can certainly get more assistance through that project. Okay, next slide. So like many employees, victims of violence who work are often at-will employees, but they may have access to employment protections under local, state, and federal law in certain situations. So for federal laws, that can include protections that are available through the Americans with Disabilities Act or the ADA, the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, or as I mentioned, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And along with these federal protections, many states and local laws also protect employees who are experiencing domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking from negative employment impacts and mandate provision of paid or unpaid time off to address needs that arise from the impacts of experiencing these forms of violence. So this diagram shows all the different types of state level employment protections that are available for survivors of domestic violence. As we'll get into, not every state offers all these protections, but this shows kind of what's possible. Next slide. And so fortunately, in California, survivors are entitled to kind of all of these core protections. So anti-discrimination provisions, reasonable accommodation, paid safe leave, and unemployment insurance. And we can share a state handout that goes into more detail on the specific laws and eligibility guidelines for these protections in California. But just to note, there is a lot of coverage for survivors in California compared to other states. Next slide. So workplace protections generally fall into these four categories. There's leave protections, and these are designed to allow eligible employees to take paid or unpaid time off for reasons related to abuse, right? To take time off maybe to heal from injuries, receive treatment, go to court, find housing. And then we have an unemployment insurance. And this allows survivors to qualify for unemployment, even if they voluntarily leave their jobs as a result of the abuse or to address the impacts of abuse. And this is a type of social insurance program that's funded both through federal money and also money from companies, like through payroll tax. And this is really important because survivors often lose their jobs or must leave their jobs due to the abuse. And access to unemployment insurance benefits are really helpful in allowing survivors to hold on to some measure of financial security at a really critical time. And then anti-discrimination provisions offer protection from discrimination, harassment, and retaliation or being fired by employers. So if an employee has experienced domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and discloses and experiences retaliation from their employer as a result of disclosing, these provisions can kick in. And then lastly, we have reasonable accommodation, which allow employees to request certain adjustments at work to address their abuse. And so there's just a lot of variation again with how this plays out by state. For example, some states offer extended paid leave to survivors, while other states offer only limited unpaid leave. In some states, protections only apply to survivors of domestic violence, while other states have more robust protections to victims of sexual assault, stalking, and other forms of violence or abuse. So all of these different provisions are really important, helpful, but I'm going to delve into just two of these protections, which are leave and reasonable accommodations, which I think are especially important for employers to consider. Next slide, please. So time off protections are really critical to supporting survivors of domestic violence in being able to manage and address all of the different impacts of experiencing abuse, right? Whether that's physical or economic or emotional, and they need leave protections to be able to address those impacts without fear of losing their job. And just to note that unpaid leave, can be useful, but it's not the ideal option for many survivors, right? They want to be able to still maintain a stable source of income. Next slide. And then reasonable accommodations are a type of employment law that require employers to provide reasonable accommodations to employees who are survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking to increase their safety at work and enable them to maintain employment. And you're going to hear me say this many times. Each state law has different ways of interpreting and describing these protections. They may even define these terms differently and how they're enforced. But one thing to highlight is that the reasonable accommodations for employees who are victims of these forms of violence are in addition to the reasonable accommodations that are provided under state and federal law for employees with qualifying disabilities, right? So this accommodation process is legally distinct from the reasonable accommodation process that's protected under the ADA. And reasonable accommodations can really make a difference in supporting a survivor's ability to stay safe and still be able to perform their core job duties, right? Some survivors have shared that often employers will default to suggesting paid or unpaid leave, so to address the impacts of abuse, when survivors would often prefer some of these adjustments to keep them safe, but also maintain access to income and stable employment. Next slide. So these are some examples of what a reasonable accommodation could look like. It could be transferring or reassigning a survivor to a different location or work site. For example, if a perpetrator of domestic violence and the victim have the same employer, maybe they're working the same shifts, a reasonable accommodation could be transferring or reassigning them to help them maintain their safety. Another accommodation could be implementing a modified or flexible work schedule so a survivor can go to court to get a protective order or attend medical appointments. And as a lot of you know, many service providers are also open 9 to 5, making it really difficult for survivors to keep their employment if they don't have that flexibility to change their schedule. Another example is putting privacy measures to protect a survivor at work by limiting access to their personal work information. So keeping their number or office location off an employer's site or directory, or putting in additional security measures or protocols that could prevent a perpetrator's access to the workplace and to the survivor. And all these accommodations not only support the safety of the survivor, but ensure the safety of the workplace and other employees. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jordyn.
Awesome. We can go to the next slide. Before we dive a little deeper, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what are some challenges a survivor may face in the workplace, and how might a survivor of domestic violence in the workplace, like what might be reasons they wouldn't report or delay reporting experiencing abuse? What may be some of the reasons that would prevent them from wanting to make a report? Let's see in the chat what we're thinking. Fear of losing a job, absolutely. They may feel embarrassed, fear of being fired, not wanting to lose jobs, stigma. They may feel ashamed. Retribution from the offender. Impact on their children, absolutely. So we're seeing, the personal impacts of the survivor and how they may be experiencing emotional responses to trauma. They may have fear of losing their needed financial support if their job is impacted. It could have wider impacts impacting their children and how they're able to support them. Opportunities of future growth within the company, retaliation, these are all good. Thank you all so much for dropping that in the chat. We can go to the next slide. So after thinking about some of the ways that a survivor may experience challenges in the workplace as a result of experiencing domestic violence, it's really important that we frame our prevention and response efforts in a way that truly centers the survivor. So being survivor-centered means that every action we take, every policy we implement, and every support that we offer puts the survivor's experience, voice, and autonomy at the forefront. This approach respects the rights of survivors, including their right to safety, privacy, and to make decisions about their own lives without coercion or pressure. It honors their wishes, recognizing that survivors know best what they need, whether that's confidentiality, accommodations at work, or access to resources. Being survivor-centered also means actively listening to the survivor's needs and responding with flexibility and respect. And this might look different for each person depending on their situation. And at its core, a survivor-centered approach prioritizes safety in the broadest sense: physical safety from harm, emotional safety in feeling heard and supported, and psychological safety that avoids re-traumatization. It's important to uphold the survivor's dignity by treating them with respect, valuing their experiences, and rejecting blame, judgment, or stigma. Supporting a survivor's well-being means addressing the full scope of their health, physical, mental, and emotional, and creating work environments that foster their healing and resilience.
When organizations and workplaces commit to a survivor-centered approach, they move beyond just a one-size-fits-all or compliance-driven mindset. Instead, they're creating spaces where survivors feel empowered to come forward, are met with compassion and understanding, and are able to receive the support that meets their needs and circumstances. We can go to the next slide. And so a safety plan is a really important survivor-led process designed to enhance safety, not just at home, but also in the community and in a survivor's workplace. A safety plan is tailored to the unique needs and circumstances of each survivor, empowering them to take control of their safety in ways that feel most effective and feasible to their own personal situation. In the workplace context, safety plans can include practical measures like changing the survivor's work location or shift hours to reduce contact with their abuser, or updating contact information to protect their privacy. Other strategies might involve securing entrances to the workplace or limiting who can access certain areas to prevent unauthorized or threatening individuals from being able to enter. Providing escorts to and from vehicles or public transportation can help survivors feel safer going from point A to point B. Alerting security personnel and other trusted coworkers about potential threats can create a network of awareness and support in the workplace. And then some workplaces use tools like code words or panic buttons to allow for discreet calls for help during emergencies. And so it's really important that safety planning is developed in partnership, collaboratively with the survivor and an employer or another domestic violence support agency. And it's important that, you maintain respecting their privacy, honoring their choices. They know what's right for them. And yeah, so just make sure that you prioritize the survivor's safety and autonomy during the entire safety planning process. And so with that, with a few strategies and resources on how to effectively be able to respond to domestic violence in your workplace, there's a few resources that we want to highlight. If we want to go to the next slide. The next one. So on our website, Workplaces Respond, we have a number of resources that we've created to help employers and organizations to be able to recognize and respond to domestic violence in the workplace. Some of these resources include an employer guide to safety planning, a guide for supervisors, annual checklist that can be done every year. And then, as Nina mentioned, our Advancing Safety Through Employment Rights project is a more comprehensive project that has a little bit more context on legal rights for survivors in the workplace. We also wanted to highlight two of the national hotline services that can definitely be used as a resource to you or your coworkers or employers or employees at your organization: the National Domestic Violence Hotline and the National Sexual Assault Hotline. And again, we'll be sharing these slides out so you'll have access to all of these links. And so we can go to the next slide. It would be really helpful if we could hear your feedback from today's training so we can improve them for the future. If you could take a moment, scan the QR code, click the link in the chat, and fill out some of those questions, we would really appreciate it. Give you just a few more moments to grab that. And we can go to the next slide. And just to plug, we do have an upcoming webinar with our Advancing Safety for Employment Rights project. They'll be doing an in-depth webinar covering anti-discrimination protections and reasonable accommodations for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. This webinar is going to be on June 17th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. and we will drop the registration link in the chat. And then lastly, if you are interested in staying up to date on the Advancing Safety Project, please feel free to email the email listed on the screen to sign up to stay informed on updates, and we'll be happy to reach back out to you all. So I will thank you all so much for coming.